Okay, we are now live on YouTube. I will introduce our speaker. So, welcome medical students and all those who are joining in on YouTube. Before we start, just a few remarks, just like yesterday. Medical students can ask questions after the lecture in the Google Meet chat and by turning on their microphone. All those that are listening on YouTube can use the Slido app. The link and the code for the app is in the description. And if we have enough time, my assistants will read your questions to the speaker. Culinary Clash is the last out of our two webinars in the East Meets West project, and I'm happy to announce today's speaker, Nikhil Mandalaparthy. Nikhil is the Advocacy Director for Hindus for Human Rights. He previously worked with the Aspen Institute's Inclusive America project, where he built a nationwide network of leaders working to strengthen religious pluralism in the US. His writings and reporting on religious and politics in South Asia and his diaspora has appeared in numerous media outlets, and he has presented at the 2018 Parliament of Works Religions in Toronto, Canada, the 2020 Impact Conference at the Arizona State University, and the G20 Interfaith Forum. Nikhil, thank you so much for joining us, and you may start your presentation. If you need to share your presentation, there is just a button beneath the boxes with the cameras.
Okay, great. So I will share my screen. But first, I just want to say hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Tamara, for having me. And I'm really excited to be talking to such a large group of people and sharing a little bit about food and religion and caste and politics in India. So like Tamara mentioned, I'm with an organization called Hindus for Human Rights. We're based here in Washington, D.C., and we have chapters in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK as well. And we are a human rights advocacy organization that is advocating for pluralism, human rights, and civil rights for all in South Asia and North America. So I'm really excited to be sharing a little bit today. And so I will have a PowerPoint that I'm just getting up here. 1 second. All right. Is everyone able to see the PowerPoint right now? Can someone just give me a yes or no? Yeah? Okay, cool. So yeah, today I wanted to talk a little bit about the myth of vegetarian India, caste, religion, and food. So before I really get started, though, I just wanted to start off with more of an interactive question for everyone. What do you know about Indian food? So if you can just maybe unmute yourself quickly and blurt out a few responses or put in the chat. We could just take like a minute or two. I'd just love to hear from people some answers to this question. And it's okay to say, I don't know anything.
My first association is spicy.
Spicy, yeah, that's real.
Yeah, I would also associate it with spicy flavors.
Mm-hmm. So we got some spice. Any other ideas about food?
It's also recommended as a beginner vegetarian diet because it can be easily made vegetarian, unlike our cuisine, for example.
Right, yeah. So that's something that I'll be talking a lot about is the prominence of vegetarian food in Indian cuisine. So I'm just curious, are there like a lot of Indian restaurants in Croatia? Is it like easy to find? Because I've never been myself. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, and throughout this presentation, feel free to just like unmute yourself if you have any questions or put it in the chat. And also, Tamara, just let me know if whenever I'm, going over time or just so we have enough time for questions. But I just wanted to start with a pretty broad overview about India's demographics and population, because when we talk about Indian food, there's the first thing we have to remember is that India is just a massive place, and so there's a lot of diversity in this country. So the map on the left is showing a map of India and the different states within the country, and it's showing the other countries around the world whose population is the same as that state. So for example, on the left over here, on the western state of Gujarat, that one state in India is equivalent to the entire population of Italy. And so we have, if you look at this, there's like the biggest state in India is equal to the population of Pakistan, Germany, UK, Saudi Arabia, France. So India's population is equivalent to all of these countries put together, which is a lot of people. And so that's just a huge set of diversity. And so it's almost as if, when we talk about Indian food, it's like saying, talking about European food. There's just so much variety and diversity in the cuisines. And one of the important ways in which India is diverse, there's different castes and languages spoken, and also religious diversity. And so I put on the right this graph which shows sort of the general breakdown of India's population. So India is a majority Hindu country. Hindus make up around 80% or so of the population, but around a fifth of the country is not Hindu and practices other religions. So the largest minority are Muslims, and then Christians, and then there's also Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, and atheists, and many other kind of communities. And so, like I mentioned, because of India's geographic diversity and sheer size, where each state has a population that's equivalent to entire countries around the world, that means that there are huge differences in Indian cuisine across the country. And so I, for example, I'm from the southern region of India, from a state called Andhra Pradesh. So that's the state here which has a population equivalent to Colombia. And so our cuisine, for example, is actually known to be one of the spiciest cuisines in India. And our state is kind of like the chili producing capital of India. And so we have very hot, spicy food. And a lot of South Indian food is eaten with rice as kind of the base. So you have rice and then a bunch of, lentils and vegetables. And if you're not vegetarian, you'll have some meat or fish kind of curries on the side. Whereas in northern India, a lot of the food is eaten with different types of breads. So there's rotis or chapatis, different sort of flat breads, and rice is not as big of a staple there. And so these are just a few different snapshots of different cuisines from across India. Here's a plate coming from Nagaland in the northeast of India. This is from Bengal in the eastern region. This is from South India. This is from Punjab in northwest India. And so there's just like a huge range of different dishes, different cuisines, different vegetables. Even if you drive for like a couple hours, you're in a new, a completely new region where there's very unique kind of specialties. And a lot of the time, the Indian food that is served in restaurants outside of India is from a very specific region of the country. And so you're not really getting the entire diversity of India, but a lot of Indian food that's served in restaurants comes from like this region here, from the state of Punjab and North India in general. But I'll get into that a little bit later. So one of the first kind of topic that I wanted to discuss in relation to food is caste, because caste and religion shape a lot of how we think about Indian food and Indian cuisines in so many different ways. So I know that for some of you, this might be a somewhat familiar kind of topic. The caste system is one of the things which India is known for across the world. But for those who are not familiar, I'll just give a very quick overview. So the caste system is a type of social hierarchy that's present in societies across South Asia, including India. And so the caste system is a hierarchy based on the family that you were born into. And so it's a birth-based system of social stratification that's existed for over, for thousands of years in the region. And caste is sort of divided into, there's two ways to think about it. There's the Varna system and there's Jati. And so Varna is what it's described in this pyramid on the left here, where traditional Hindu society, and this is true for across religions in India as well, Indian society is divided up into different sort of caste levels. So at the very top of that caste hierarchy are Brahmins, who are traditionally priests and intellectuals, scholars, people with access to education and literacy, a very small proportion of the population. And then the next level is Kshatriyas, who are the ruling class, kings and queens and rulers and warriors. Below them are Vaishyas, who are traders or merchants. And then below that are Shudras and laborers. And so those are the four varnas, the four castes. And then below them are formerly known as untouchables. And now we call them Dalits in India. And these are people who were excluded from the caste system entirely, largely because of the types of occupations that they held. So you see that, like, on the left here, each of these caste categories is associated with a specific type of occupation. And for untouchables or Dalits, those sort of occupations that they were forced to do are like cleaning human waste from streets and homes, dealing with animal carcasses, these sort of occupations that nobody else wanted to deal with, and these Dalit communities were forced into these really demeaning and degrading professions. And for a long time, this hierarchy emerged from Hindu scriptures, from Hindu texts in ancient India, and there are a lot of differences across regions where caste hierarchy looks a little bit different in South India versus North India. But for the most part, what you see, every region has Brahmins, who are these elite priestly class, and there's untouchables or Dalits at the bottom. And then there's a different sort of mix of castes in the middle. And so that's the Varna system. And then there's also Jati, which is a specific community that you're born into. And so among, for example, the Vaishya class, there are a bunch of different jatis or subcastes who are their own sort of communities who are grouped under this broader pyramid. And so the thing about caste is you're supposed to marry within your same jati or your same caste group. And so the caste system has been sustained for such a long time because intermarriage is heavily discouraged. And it's actually, there are all of these instances, if you look up the news for intercaste marriages, a lot of couples who decide to marry someone from another caste or also from another religion are often attacked or killed by their families for breaking out of this system. So it's a really pervasive and oppressive form of structuring society. And a lot of this has to do with food as well. Because the caste system is built on these notions of purity and pollution. So the idea is that the people who are at the top of this caste hierarchy are seen as being more pure, as being sort of spiritually better than others who are below them. And a lot of this translates into food and eating practices. So historically, it was a real taboo in a lot of societies in India for people of different castes to eat together. There's this idea that eating with someone who comes from a Dalit background or a lower caste background, they are a polluting force, and so it's a lot of upper caste people would refuse to eat alongside people from lower castes, and so there are a lot of these restrictions on the types of ways in which people were allowed to eat together. And there's a lot of these very pervasive structures, even today in India, where Dalit communities are not able to access the same sort of opportunities and resources that upper castes have held for a long time. And that also extends to things like malnutrition and access to nutritious, healthy food. A lot of these communities have been systemically denied the opportunity to have the same access to food resources that upper castes have had. And there are some ways in which people have pushed back against these sort of caste restrictions on eating food. For example, the Sikh faith, Sikhism is a religion practiced in Northwest India, where one of the very important practices is that everyone eats together in the same room, eating side by side the same food. And that's a really radical act in South Asia, where for so long your caste dictated, who you're allowed to eat with, the type of food you're allowed to eat. And the most obvious way in which caste and food sort of intersect is in the practice of vegetarianism. So a lot of you might know that India is famous kind of around the world for being a place where there's a lot of vegetarian cuisine, a lot of vegetarian dishes. And this perception comes from the fact that a lot of upper castes, so people who are in this top part of the pyramid here, upper castes are traditionally vegetarian. They don't eat meat because meat is associated in a lot of these communities' minds. Meat is associated with Dalit communities, it's associated with lower castes. And so as a way of kind of showing and practicing that purity that I was talking about and avoiding the pollution of these lower caste communities and their labor, a lot of upper caste communities adopted the practice of vegetarianism, and so not eating meat or fish. And so that perception, which is really only true for the top kind of elite part of Indian society, does not actually match what India looks like, as a whole. And so this map shows the prevalence, the sort of the amount of vegetarians and non-vegetarians in different Indian states. And so you'll see that for a lot of these states, the red text here is the percentage of non-vegetarian, and the green text is the percentage of vegetarians. A lot of these states are overwhelmingly non-vegetarian. So you see, like in South India, for example, the state where I'm from, Andhra Pradesh, only less than 2% of the population is actually vegetarian. Similarly, in West Bengal, less than 2% again is vegetarian. Even in like the nation's capital of Delhi, only about 40% of the population is vegetarian. And we see that in Northwest India in general, there is a larger proportion of vegetarians. But if you're looking at the entire country, it is a pretty strong kind of display that being vegetarian in India is not a universal thing. There are a lot of Indian communities who traditionally have eaten meat, and a lot of the reasons why we think of India as a vegetarian country or vegetarian friendly country is because the elite, the highest caste, the people with the most privilege have practiced this vegetarian diet, and so that is carried over into the international perception. So I wanted to talk a little bit more also about, so I just shared a little bit about caste and food. So I also want to talk about the relationship between religion and food as well in India. And so religion has played a huge role, just like I'm sure many of you are familiar. In any religious community, food is a really important part of traditions and festivals and holidays and just general sort of religious practice. And that's true for religions in India as well. For Hindus, there is a practice called prasadam, prasad or prasadam, and it's a practice of offering food to a deity, a god or a goddess in a temple or your home shrine. So you sort of prepare some food and you offer it in front of the image, and then later you have some of that food because it's been blessed by the deity. And similarly, that's true for Hinduism, and in Sufi shrines in India and in South Asia, there's something called tabarruk, which is something which has been blessed, and so it's often food that's prepared and then offered to God, and then all of the devotees have a little bit of that. And then on the bottom right here, I put a picture of what I talked about, the Sikh practice of langar, where people sit side by side and eat the same food, which is offered for free in any gurdwara or Sikh temple. So food has played a really important role in any religious community in India. But we know that a lot of religious communities also have various taboos around food. And so, for example, I'm sure many of you know that Muslims don't eat pork, for example. That's considered haram. And so a lot of Muslim communities do not eat pork. Similarly, a lot of Hindu communities, particularly upper caste Hindus, don't eat beef, or they don't kill cows. And this is not true for all Hindus. There are many Hindu communities who do eat meat and who do eat beef, particularly Dalit communities, where beef is a really important part of a lot of Dalit community diet. But for upper caste Hindus, beef is another kind of taboo. And food and religion has played a really crucial role in Indian history as well. And so during the period of British colonialism, when the British were ruling India, there was a rebellion that broke out in 1857, which was the first rebellion, one of the first rebellions against British rule in modern Indian history. And it was spurred, one of the triggers was actually this taboos over beef and pork, because as the story goes, that a number of British Indian troops were told that you have to use these new gunpowder cartridges, which contain beef and pork fat. And so they were told this, given this order by their British officers, and to bite off the trigger with your teeth, you are sort of consuming this beef fat or pork fat, which is a taboo for Hindus and Muslims. And so it was seen as violating their religious restrictions and violating their religious freedom. And so that was one of the triggers for this rebellion against the British, this forcing Indian soldiers to consume beef or pork. And today in Indian politics, again, we're seeing that taboos over food and religion and caste are very much part of the political discourse in India today. And so India's government right now is, the party in power is a right-wing Hindu nationalist party, the BJP, which promotes this idea that, India is a country where Hindus make up the majority. And so India should be a Hindu country and not a secular democracy where all religious communities are allowed to flourish and thrive, but rather India should be a country that privileges Hindus as the majority above Muslims and Christians. And what we've seen in the last several years is a real increase in violence against Muslims and Christians and Dalits, or formal untouchables. And a lot of the reason for this violence that's named is around food, and particularly around meat and beef. So there have been a number of lynchings in India, these killings of innocent sort of citizens who are attacked by these Hindu extremist mobs on the suspicion that they are either storing beef at their home, or they're killing cows, or they're smuggling cow carcasses. And so there have been these attacks where a Hindu mob attacks this Muslim man who's suspected of eating beef or having beef in his house. Or a mob will attack Dalits who are seen as transporting cows illegally to slaughter them and to kill them. And what we've seen is actually in a few states in India where this far-right Hindu party is in power, that they're starting to ban the sale of meat in various cities and in different states. So, for example, in the state of Gujarat in Western India, a number of cities and sort of local officials have said that the sale of meat is going to be prohibited and banned as a way to sort of target a lot of the traditional meat-eating communities in the state, who include Muslims and Dalits. And similarly in Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state in India, just very recently, the chief minister banned the sale of meat and alcohol around this one city called Mathura, which is a sacred sort of Hindu site. And so there's a way in which people's freedom to eat the food that they want, to consume meat and to consume beef in particular, is being attacked by the ruling government. And so there's this real decline in individual freedoms across India, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of expression. And one of the ways this is being attacked is people's freedom to eat, what they want. So the very last point I wanted to touch on as well is the question of what happens when Indian food is taken out into the world, Indian cuisine. And so I know that, there must be quite a few Indian restaurants in Croatia, as Tamara mentioned, where in the larger cities it's available. And this is true, any country in the world you go to now, Indian food is probably available in different restaurants. But like I mentioned, the type of food that's sold in a lot of these Indian restaurants comes from a very specific part of India. It comes from the Punjab region, which has a very specific kind of cuisine. And so a lot of the food that you're served in these restaurants does not represent all of Indian cuisine by any kind of stretch. It represents a very specific region, a very specific sort of set of dishes. And at the same time, the food that's served in Indian restaurants often also reflects sort of what the elite groups in India are eating. So for example, there's a very popular South Indian restaurant chain called Mysore Woodlands. And there's restaurants all over the US and in other parts of the world as well who are under this Mysore Woodland brand. And they sell what is, quote, pure South Indian vegetarian cuisine. So if you've been, paying attention to what I've been saying, this idea of purity is really important when we talked about caste and the reasons that certain communities are vegetarian. And indeed, the type of food that this restaurant serves is what is eaten by the upper caste, the elite kind of group in South India. And in fact, their logo is a South Indian Brahmin man. So it's very much, even though it hasn't stated this explicitly in their description, what they're serving is South Indian Brahmin cuisine, basically. But they're branding it as representing all of South Indian cuisine, and using this adjective of pure to refer to the food is actually a very harmful notion that's rooted in caste discrimination, where the food that's consumed and eaten by Dalit communities is not branded as pure. It's branded as polluted, dirty, it's not healthy. There's all of these ways in which the type of food that's eaten by marginalized communities, oppressed communities, is used to attack them and further discriminate against them. And I'd be curious, when we have a Q&A session, if there are any similar dynamics, for example, in Croatia, where if there are certain oppressed or marginalized communities, if there are ways that people talk about the food that they eat and the way that is used to sort of further discriminate against them. For example, here in the US, a lot of culinary practices and dishes and cuisines from Black Americans have similarly been used to mock and discriminate against Black people in the US. So there are a lot of stereotypes around certain dishes, for example, like fried chicken and watermelon and certain sort of food items which are very much play a role in a lot of Black communities' histories in the US, but a lot of racist language and media depictions will latch onto these sort of foods which are important for some Black communities. So similarly in India, there's this notion that pure food is vegetarian, it's what the upper castes eat, and it doesn't really reflect what I was showing on this map, that India is not a vegetarian nation. There are many Indians who are vegetarian, but there are even more Indians who are not. And so in order to fully appreciate and understand, Indian cuisine, and we should always call it Indian cuisines because it's many different cuisines coexisting in one large country, we have to also be mindful of the ways that caste plays into our notions of what is good food in the food that we're exposed to, and also how religion factors into that as well. And a lot of this, this diversity is really important, and I think it's really exciting to be able to celebrate and learn from so many different communities. And so rather than homogenizing all of Indian food and sort of uplifting this one vegetarian, Punjabi, North Indian view of what Indian cuisine is, we should all try to learn as much about the variations in Indian cuisine, the sort of food practices of marginalized communities, oppressed castes. There are really, if you look up Brahmin cuisine, for example, Brahmins are, like I mentioned, the upper caste. If you Google Brahmin recipes, Brahmin food, so many results will pop up by different websites and cookbooks, etc. But if you Google Dalit cuisine, the food practiced by untouchables, former untouchables, the Dalits, there are very few, if any, results that show up. These communities do not have that same respect and opportunities that these upper caste cooks and chefs have enjoyed. And so I think there's only one cookbook in the world that exists for Dalit cuisine. There's very few, if any, restaurants which serve the kind of food that is consumed by a lot of Dalit communities. And hopefully that will change, in the future. And I can say personally myself, I grew up in a vegetarian family, an upper caste family. I'm still a vegetarian, but for me, I grew up thinking that my understanding of Indian food and of my state's cuisine in particular was what everyone else was eating. I thought that my culture was the default. And so to see this map where actually the state that I'm from the minority. Only 2% of people are like me, and 98% do eat meat, and their idea of what our state's cuisine is actually very different. That's been a humbling experience for me, and something which I've really tried to learn from. Is like, how can I better understand my own heritage and my role, my place in this caste hierarchy, in religion, and caste, religion, and food are so connected in Indian society and Indian culture. And so I hope this was a little bit of a small glimpse into how that plays out in my experience. So I will stop there and open it up for any questions and discussion.
Well, I can break the ice and ask, what do you think about the European and general the Western notion of eating meat in the higher classes? So in the medieval times, in the history of Europe, usually it was the higher classes, the kings, the queens, the rulers, who had more money, who could afford meat, and usually people who worked in the rural parts, they only eat vegetables. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting that in, like you mentioned, in Europe, where meat was seen as a more elite thing, in India, historically, that's been, flipped, where actually, the most elite higher caste diets have been traditionally vegetarian, even though there have been some exceptions. So, for example, in Bengal, which is in eastern India, even Brahmins are also eat fish and meat. And in other parts of India, that's true as well. So it's hard to make these sort of generalizations. But I think one way that, one other reason for this promotion of vegetarian also does come from religious reasons as well. So in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, these are a few different religions practiced in India. Being vegetarian is seen as a spiritual practice because you are engaging in ahimsa, which is nonviolence. And so in order to live a nonviolent life, one practice which many people engage in is they say, okay, I'm not gonna eat meat because that's participating in a cycle of violence. And that is definitely one reason why some people are vegetarian. So not everyone, I would say, who is practicing a vegetarian diet is doing so, as a way to be oppressing lower castes or to perpetuate these harmful ideas. There are definitely spiritual practices that for which vegetarianism is an important part. And even among Muslim communities, for example, there are some Sufi orders, for example, the Rishi order, which was active in Kashmir in the medieval period, where these were Sufi Muslim ascetics who also took up vegetarianism as a spiritual practice. But I think back to your question of, why is it that meat was an elite thing in Europe and associated with lower castes in India? I think that goes back to how the caste system is structured and the idea that people who are working with animals, who are working, dealing with death in particular, animal carcasses, disposing of dead cows and dead animals. A lot of upper caste families and powerful dominant caste families, for example, if they owned livestock or cattle and the cow died, the family themselves would not deal with that dead carcass. They would call a Dalit untouchable family to come and take that carcass away. And so they wouldn't even touch it. And so that association of death with these untouchable communities is, I think, one of the reasons why meat was seen as a impure, sort of polluting kind of substance. The association between lower caste communities and death and pollution is very strong. And so I think meat just became part of that sort of way of thinking about food and cuisine. And it's important to note that in the very earliest scriptures of Hinduism, there was actually, animal sacrifice was a thing. And these earliest Hindu texts celebrate eating cows and beef and sacrificing them for the gods. And so it's actually a shift that happened even in Hindu practice, where vegetarianism as an elite Brahmin sort of practice was eventually won out over those sort of meat-centric, non-vegetarian practices.
There aren't any in the chat still. Okay, can I ask one more question, if that's okay? You said you live in America. How did you adapt to the Western notion of food now here in the US? Was it difficult?
Yeah.
How do other people who come from your country adapt to the westernized version?
Yeah, so I've grown up in the US my whole life. So I never really felt like a strong, needing to adapt, I guess, because I grew up around American food, Western food from when I was very young. At home, we would mostly have Indian food that my parents would cook. But I'd say that, being vegetarian in the US was definitely a challenge in some ways, depending on where you live in the country. A lot of the bigger cities, especially now, it's very easy to be vegetarian. But if you're traveling to small towns or more rural areas, vegetarian options are definitely limited. But I think in general, American cuisine is, becoming very popular also in India. There are a lot of any sort of American fast food chain you can think of is also now in India. And so there isn't too much of a shift, I guess, that I had to adjust to. I'm sure my parents had a little bit more of a adjustment when they came to the US, because they immigrated when they were in their 20s and they were, adults. But as a kid growing up, I think there were definitely stereotypes around Indian food, particularly around, Indian food being smelling bad or looking bad. There were a lot of, I think, negative stereotypes that lead a lot of Indian kids growing up to be very embarrassed of Indian food, and so they like don't want to take it to school because they'll be made fun of by their classmates and things like that, you know, teased for their cuisine. But at the same time, I think Indian food has really also become like a cool thing in the US, like a very hip, trendy kind of thing, just as like yoga has become a very popular thing across the world. I think Indian food has also grown in sort of popularity. And so that also does lead to the question, I guess, of like appropriation and commodification of Indian cuisine, where, you know, a lot of these places will, you know, there are examples of appropriation where, you know, credit is not fully given to the communities that originally sort of ate these foods or developed these cuisines, where now, like, you know, we have like turmeric lattes or these very trendy things where it's branded as a superfood and like a new discovery without acknowledging that people in South Asia have been eating these foods and consuming these spices and stuff for a long time. So there's been, I think, some of that commodification has been taking place as well, but there's definitely a wide popularity of Indian cuisine. And I think my hope is that as Indian food becomes more popular in the US and across the world, we'll see more sort of opportunities for different cuisines in India to receive that same sort of popularity. So it's not the same like North Indian, Punjabi, like butter chicken and saag paneer and you know, all of these standard kind of dishes which are very popular, but more variety in like having cuisines from different parts of India and having cuisines from Dalit communities. I think it would be really amazing if there's a, you know, a young Dalit chef who's able to come to the US and open a Dalit, you know, a restaurant which showcases food from Dalit communities. I think that sort of exposure is really necessary, not just for broader Americans, but also for Indian Americans who may not realize that we have this diversity of cuisines in our own community.
Okay, if there are no more questions, Nikhil, I would like to thank you for presenting this today. I hope everybody learned something new. Thank you again, and medical students, you are free to leave. And Nikhil, I say goodbye to you as well.
Great. Thank you all so much for listening, and it was nice to see you again, Tamara.
Nice to see you too again.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.